All right, welcome. Great to see everybody today. A couple of really fun things in the chat. Continue to introduce yourself if you get a moment. Dawn had a huge giving day up in Pennsylvania. There was some record giving out in Key West, a lot of success happening generally across the board. Annalise caught my eye. She's doing 3 miles of treadmill walking while listening to this webinar, which is a great way to stay relaxed and happy. So, and it sounds like a lot of beautiful weather. So really happy to be here today. Really glad this week is not last week, which was, I think, a lot and a little bit of chaos for all of us. So really just grateful for you all. So yeah, if you get a chance, continue to introduce yourself. Make sure to click that panelist and attendees button and share anything that's making you happy. Just a quick note, we'll share the slides later today as well as the recordings. So don't feel like you have to furiously take notes. And then there's a really important survey at the end with a couple of things that we'll talk about. So if you can do that, that would be a big gift to us because we read all of it and it helps us inform both how to do these better, but also the other topics that you want to participate in the future. So really glad to have everybody here. One other note is that I'm calling it on phone audio. I'm actually in Southern California at the moment. We had some pretty rough wind over the weekend, some gusts up to 45, 50 miles an hour. And it means the internet's been a little tricky. So just bear with me. If anything goes down, we'll be back in 30 seconds. That may or may not happen. All right, so we are here to talk about navigating fundraising in post-election America. And we're going to talk about a few things. But before we do, I want to share that, again, my colleague Simone has put a bunch of work in to make your professional development a bit easier. So this course is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. So just make a note. You can also certify your participation in this survey. I previously told you that mostly CFRE is self-recorded and that you rarely get audited, but actually last week someone got audited and they wrote to us and we were able to provide all the records. So just make sure you do that for your own professional development. Today's agenda, we're going to do some very quick intros as usual. We'll share how your week is going, talk about where the election stands and the impact that that is likely to have. We'll talk about how historically elections have changed fundraising. We'll talk about some of the possible policy changes that Joe Biden is proposing and what that might mean for charitable giving. And we'll talk through a few next steps. So we'll go fairly quickly. I'm going to try to speak a little bit more slowly than I do sometimes, but this is exciting stuff. So sometimes I'll get carried away. Introductions. So many of you know me, but we have a lot of new folks on the call today. So my name is Patrick. I am lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called FreeWill alongside my dear friend, Jenny Shias-Spradling. And we're joined by 62 wonderful, diverse, amazing people that has raised nearly $2 billion in bequests and stocks and QCDs and other things. So really glad to be here. As you can tell, we're normally in New York, but now we're all on Zoom around the country. So how is your week going? Which is a really big question to ask, especially this week. And here's what you said. So we asked folks how they're feeling. This yellow line is anxiety. It is at 60%. To be fair, this survey was taken late last week before election results were called. And so imagine it might drip down a little bit, but you can see it has not been this high since March 13th, which was really the beginning of pandemic news for many people. So maybe everyone can just sort of take a deep breath and settle in. I mean, we hope that the next few weeks become less anxious than the last one, certainly. The other thing we've asked is, what are you worried about? And you can see people are getting a little bit more comfortable and confident around hitting their goals, which is that blue top curve. And that's been the biggest challenge. So hopefully this will help you. One other thing I wanted to mention is about 2 weeks ago, I think maybe 4 weeks ago, we did a session on effective written communication and people loved it. And one of the things we did was we gave away one of my favorite books, which is a book called On Writing Well, to about 20 people that were randomly selected. And first of all, thank you to all of you who got the books and then wrote thank you notes. But secondly, what I wanted to do that again, one of my other favorite books is this book called Influence by a guy named Robert Cialdini, who's a professor. And it really talks about how to have compelling conversations and how to be heard and how to get your message across. And so we're going to send this to a bunch of folks. So at the end, just drop your name in the survey. It is one of the things that's going to really help you hit your goals. You can also use it on your boss and your spouse. I mean, it's not trickery. It's just how do people hear things, and how are you a compelling messenger? And so I love this book, and I'm really excited. Hope you get one, and also would love to talk about it once you read it, because I find it just totally fascinating. So we'll talk about how to get that at the end. All right, so elections, where do we stand right now? And I'll recap this quickly because most of you know it. A couple things have happened. Joe Biden has been declared president of the United States by the AP and major networks on Saturday. The Trump campaign is contesting the election, although in some ways this feels less catastrophic than one might have expected. In the media and others, it still feels like a foregone conclusion. The House of Representatives, many of you know, has been called for Democrats, potentially a little bit more narrowly than many expected. But the Senate control hangs in the balance. So it is dependent on 2 Senate races in Georgia. Those races will be held on January 5th, that's 2021. That should say 2021. So we'll correct that before the slides go out. All right, so that's basically where we are. What happens to fundraising after elections? Well, here's what you all said. So when we asked people, what do you think will be the impact if President Trump wins on fundraising for your specific organization? Now, 44% said, I don't know, but 21% said a positive impact, and 15% said a negative impact. Now, we asked what happens if Vice President Biden wins, which seems to be the outcome. 20% said a positive impact, 11% said a negative impact, and then 24% said no impact. We also asked what would happen in a contested election, potentially more contested than what we're seeing at the moment. Just want to double check that folks can hear me. I got a note that I might be on mute, which doesn't seem to be the case. Great, okay, thank you. Appreciate everybody responding so quickly there. So if the election is contested, 39% said that might be a negative impact. A bunch of folks didn't know. Almost no one said it's a positive impact. So that's a big shift. Now, this election contestation is a little bit less, frankly, feels less serious than what we might have expected, but a good thing to keep an eye on, and we'll talk about how to impact that. All right, so the way that we can figure out what will happen next is we can look back at history. So the big question here is, how do you think nonprofit giving was affected after the 2012 election and after the 2016 election? So take a moment right now, put it in the chat. Do you think it went up? Do you think it went down? Do you think it had no change? Just take a guess, and I'll give you 15 seconds just to write your guesses in. All right, so we got a lot of ups, we got a lot of no changes. Also, it's sort of remarkable to look at how, obviously these gentlemen are all opponents, but how cordial it was compared to what we're seeing. Well, here's the results from 2012. So you basically had a net of about the same. And what happened is political donors actually went up in terms of nonprofit giving, whereas non-political donors went down. Now, that's sort of surprising because you think, wow, political donors just gave all this money to Senate races, to House races, to presidential races. And non-political donors, well, they've been saving their money, they should be giving more. But what happens is that political donors are extra engaged and are now in the habit of giving, whereas non-political donors who decided to check out from a pretty frenetic election might be drawing back overall. So that's the shift from 11 to 12. The other thing that we're seeing is that there are some shifts here, but for political donors, male-only households tended to increase their giving. Female-only households had, female-only households had basically no change. And then male-female households also increased their giving. So there's a shift there, but then non-political donors across the board sort of felt like this might be a little bit too much. In 2016, there's some really interesting data here as well. So obviously, pretty meaningful election in 2016. And here's what happened. So overall giving was up by 2.6% after the election, but giving shifted. And you saw 300,000 new members of the ACLU, huge increase in post-election giving to the Anti-Defamation League, also known as the ADL, a large spike in giving to women's rights groups. And this actually isn't unusual. So here's the research on post-election giving to politically aligned groups, meaning folks that aren't necessarily explicitly Democratic or explicitly Republican, but do have a pretty clear liberal bent or conservative bent. Well, we saw 58% increases in contributions to organizations aligned with the losing party. Not necessarily the folks you would think maybe success breeds success. In fact, the opposite is true. So if you're a liberal organization, you're probably rooting for a liberal president, but your development director, sort of in the back of her head, thinks it won't be so bad if a conservative president gets in there. There's a 3% decrease to giving aligned with the winning party. Now, why is this the case? Well, what we see is what's called negative partisanship, or opposition is often stronger in fueling giving, especially small donor rapid giving, than opportunity or room for improvement. It's a really interesting dynamic. It sort of triggers the fight or flight reflex in a lot of humans. And so fear or anger often triggers, unfortunately, more giving than hope or happiness. The impact, by the way, is significantly larger when the result is unexpected. So in 2016, where most analysts would have expected a Hillary Clinton win, that triggered just enormous giving from liberal aligned groups. And so the more that your donor base is surprised by the result, the larger the impact will have. Audrey mentions that when she worked for the Sierra Club, they saw contributions spike with the election of George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004. And that aligns with a lot of the research that we're seeing. There is, by the way, a slight decrease to non-aligned apolitical organizations. So you may see some donors become more politicized and giving less to things like museums and colleges. But the result tends to be relatively small. This, by the way, is all thanks to Michael Conklin and Renee Fauché, who are two professors who do all of this research. So that's sort of the impact of overall elections. But let's talk about potential policy changes and what those might mean. Well, the first big one that's going to happen to affect charitable giving is around the qualified charitable distributions component of giving. So remember, and some of you know this, but a reminder because we have some new folks, qualified charitable distributions are defined as gifts directly out of the IRA of an older donor. Older donors, 72 and over, traditionally must take what we call a required minimum distribution out of their IRA. So they're forced to do so. The government says, money going into your IRA wasn't taxed the first time. We need that tax money at some point. Please take it out of your IRA. And so it forces you to take a required minimum distribution every year. Now, donors really like QCDs because they get a tax benefit even if they don't itemize their deductions. And so this has seen a huge shift, about tripling over the last few years. There is $9 trillion in IRAs in the United States. So this type of gift really, really matters. You have this huge baby boomer population. A lot of them have IRAs. A lot of them have RMDs. And this will be a shift. So what's the change? Well, in 2020, RMDs were suspended, meaning the stock market crashed in the spring, as you remember. And the government said, look, you don't have to take money out of your IRA because it might be much lower than we expected. And this happened also in 2008 and 2009. But yesterday, the stock market hit record highs. And these will be back in full force in 2021. So you should expect that QCDs are going to grow by 50 to 75% next year over this year, after growing 3 times since 2017. This is the fastest growing type of gift in the United States. These gifts, by the way, are still very powerful gifts at the end of 2020, because this is still pre-tax money that will definitely get taxed at some point. QCDs were actually up, at this point, are up 20% over last year at the same time, even though there's no RMDs, because people are getting used to it and they're getting really comfortable giving QCDs. And once people give QCDs, they continue. So this will be a big shift due to legislation in terms of new types of giving. So that will definitely happen. Now, what we're dealing with is 2 possible scenarios. And we'll talk about both what will happen if Democrats control the Senate and what will happen if Republicans control the Senate, because this is still unknown for us. So there are 2 Georgia Senate races that are going to run off, as I mentioned earlier, on January 5th. Race 1, a gentleman named Jon Ossoff, who is actually, I think would be the youngest senator. He's only about 33, which makes many of us feel like underachievers, versus David Perdue, who is a scion of the Perdue family. He's a Republican. They just had a very close race. And then Raphael Warnock, who's actually the minister at MLK's old church in Atlanta, versus Kelly Loeffler, who interestingly enough is the wealthiest member of Congress, or at least the wealthiest member of the Senate. These 2 races will determine which party controls the Senate. Right now it's 50 Republicans, likely if we count North Carolina and Alaska, and 48 Democrats. In a 50-50 world, Kamala Harris as vice president casts deciding votes, and Democrats take the Senate. This will also be the most expensive race from a Senate perspective in US history, and could be about $500 million in spending. So it's a really good time to own a local TV station in Georgia. Now, why are we talking about this in a fundraising conversation? Well, Senate control will dictate tax policy. Tax policy will dictate changes in fundraising strategies for donors and for nonprofits. So we have two scenarios here. We have Democratic control and Republican control. And we'll see what will happen. Republican control, by the way, is slightly more likely, but not definite. So if you look at betting markets, Minister Warnock is likely to win his race, at least as the betting favorite, and Senator Perdue is likely to win his race against John Ossoff. But we'll see, and this is really, you can probably get a sense for 2020, it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen. But let's talk first, let's presume for a moment that Democrats take the Senate, and we're going to talk through some of these shifts, and then we'll talk about what happens if Republicans take the Senate. So if Democrats win the Senate, a couple of really big shifts are going to happen. One, we might shift the maximum deduction for charitable gifts to 28% from 37%, which means that if you're a very high earner, you're not going to be able to take that full deduction. And this is going to be true of a bunch of other deductions, not just charitable gifts. So don't feel picked on, but it is going to have a very significant impact in the charitable giving space. We're also going to discuss as a possibility raising the top capital gains to almost 40%. This is going to have a massive impact if it happens, potentially one of the biggest effects on charitable giving in years, if not decades. We're also changing the threshold for the estate tax. Again, this is hypothetical if Democrats take the Senate, by about 50%, and that will be a really big shift. And there's one other estate tax change that we'll talk about as well. All right, so that's sort of the big shifts, but we're going to dive in and figure out what happens with each one. So first, let's talk about what would happen if we shifted the maximum deduction for charitable gifts to 28% from 37%. So what we mean here is that if you give $100, you get potentially a tax savings of $28 instead of $37 if you are a very wealthy person. If your marginal tax rate is below 28%, you just get whatever your marginal tax rate is. So feel free to pop in questions if this isn't clear at any point, because we are going to get a little bit wonky, and this is going to be more tax policy focused than a lot of conversations like this. So what will happen? Cash gifts are going to likely decrease from top donors. So previously, a $100,000 cash gift might net the donor $37,000 in tax savings, but instead only $28,000. I hope this makes sense. Should be pretty clear. But so you can imagine that cash gifts are going to go down a little bit because there's less tax benefit. Now, what else is going to happen? Well, QCDs are going to likely increase even more. Why is this the case? Because remember, QCDs, qualified charitable distributions, also called IRA charitable rollovers, reduce income instead of increasing deductions. So they're perfectly tax efficient, no matter whether or not you itemize deductions, and regardless of what your marginal income tax is. So if you're a donor, a wealthy donor, $100,000 qualified charitable distribution saves you $37,000 in taxes, while giving exactly the same amount of cash saves you only $28,000. Now, $28,000 is still a big savings, but that's really meaningful. And you can imagine if you can walk a donor through that, A, how grateful they'll be, and B, maybe that they'll give a larger gift. So this is a really important thing to understand if this happens. So that's the effect on cash and QCDs. We're going to talk about what capital gains are going to do to stocks and donor advised funds, and then we'll talk about what estate tax changes might do to planned gifts. So I'm going to step back for a moment, because when we talk to a lot of giving officers, they don't always have their heads around capital gains taxes. So I'm going to just do a very quick primer on capital gains and capital gains taxes, and then we'll get to implications. So if you know this, just be patient. If you don't know this, this is a really good thing to get smart about. So what are capital gains? Capital gains at its core, and there's more convoluted definitions, it's the difference between what you paid for an investment and what you sold it for. Right? So it's not the total value of the investment, It's the difference between what you bought it for and what you sold it for. Just as a very simple example, Dorothy bought Apple stock in 2012 for $20,000. She sells it in 2020 for $100,000. Therefore, she has a capital gain of $80,000. This is the price of sale minus the price of purchase. I hope this is clear. This is what capital gains means. So what are capital gains taxes? Well, they're a tax paid on capital gains. This is different than income tax, which is paid on salaries. Most of you are paying income tax in your current job. Capital gains are currently 15 to 20% at the federal level, depending on your overall income level. Many states also tax capital gains as state tax. So oftentimes you'll get ordinary income tax on those capital gains at the state level. So a place like California, at its highest rate, is taxing capital gains at 13% on top of what you're paying at the federal level. Biden's proposal, so this would be true if Biden wins and we have a Democratic Senate and the Democratic House is a foregone conclusion, is to treat capital gains roughly the same as ordinary income. So if you got $100,000 of capital gains, they say, look, we're happy for you, but we're going to treat that the way someone who's working a couple thousand hours to make that same amount of money. So the top capital gains tax rate would be 39.6, which will also be the top income tax rate in this scenario. This, by the way, makes stock and investment giving extremely attractive. This is going to become by far the most attractive gift for wealthy donors. I'm going to walk you through why right now. So let's understand capital gains taxes, and we'll just do an example. Mark from California bought one share of Netflix in 2016 for $100. Today, Mark sold it for $500. His capital gain is $400. I assume this is going to make sense by now. So Mark has a capital gain of $400. He's going to pay taxes on that. His federal capital gains taxes, under a Biden administration with a Democratic Senate, is going to be about 40% of $400. So $158 in federal capital gains. So that's his capital gains tax. But he also pays California income tax on this. Now, this example, Mark is a wealthy person in California, so some people will pay lower rates. But we're going to just roll with this example because many of you have many well-to-do donors in California, and it's really, really worth knowing. So his total in capital gains taxes, before we get income tax deductions, is $211. So he's avoiding $211 in capital gains taxes. So, but the reason that stock giving is so valuable is that donors save on two types of taxes at the same time. So the donor avoids all capital gains taxes and state income on capital gains. This is what we just walked through. They also get a full income tax deduction for the present value of the stock. In some cases, in the Biden administration, again, it might be capped at 28%, but it's still an income tax deduction. So here's what this looks like for Mark. Mark's from California. He's donating his Netflix stock. He avoids $211 in capital gains and state income tax. Now, he also receives a $500 state and federal deduction on his income taxes and capped at 28%. So I know this is a lot. I hope you're sticking with me. Here's what that looks like. He saves $140 in federal taxes and another $66 in state taxes. And his total tax avoided is $417. So, which is 83% of his $500 gift, which means it basically costs him, let's see, about $83 to make this gift. So, and have $500 in impact. So you can imagine that someone like Mark is looking hard at how to give this away, because the value to him of selling this is actually not that much more than the value to giving it away. And his impact here is somewhere between 5 and 6 times what he actually pays for it. So these gifts are what's going to shift from someone giving a couple $1,000s to someone giving tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds to thousands, because the tax savings is so great as a proportion of the gift made. So I hope this makes sense. Feel free to ask some questions in the chat if you need to, or in the Q&A, and we'll get to it. But this is really, really important. That 83% number, which is still going to be about 2/3 in a state with no income tax, is remarkably high. And if you can move your cash donors over to this type of giving, you'll get significantly larger gifts from exactly the same people. So What else is going to happen? So significant increase in stock giving, as we talked about, right? So I hope you all get that. Stock giving becomes way more beneficial for donors, and so those gifts are going to be much larger. Now, there's a significant increase in donor-advised fund giving as well. Now, why would that be the case? Well, remember, we talked about this 2 weeks ago. There's something that a lot of people don't know about donor-advised funds. And a lot of people are trying to come up with a good donor-advised fund strategy. But what's true is that 60% of money going into donor-advised funds is stocks and non-cash assets, meaning that all of that money that people are seeing as really beneficial to give, they drop right into a donor-advised fund. And frankly, the way that you can get better at sort of donor-advised fund strategy is to get better at taking that stock in the first place before it goes into donor-advised funds. So really, really important. This will also have a decrease in cash giving. Why? Because the comparative benefit, remember that 28% cap, is going to be much lower than the new benefit of giving stock. So you'll just see that balance shift and more stock giving and less cash giving. So if you're dependent right now on cash gifts, you need to be getting smart about non-cash gifts, because your cash gifts are going to go down and your non-cash gifts are going to go. So that's a little bit on stocks. There's actually a bunch of questions on this. So before we get to estate plans, I'm going to answer a couple of these, and so we'll go from there. There was let's see. So Amanda asks, so Mark is going to donate the $400 to his favorite nonprofit. Does the nonprofit receive it as cash? Amanda, what happens here is that the nonprofit receives the stock and usually immediately sells it. So they have $400 in cash. For them, it's basically the same outcome. And for Mark, it's much better. So you're taking the stock and then you're selling it immediately. And most organizations will have some brokerage set up to do that. And those brokerages are under instruction to liquidate it immediately. Nicole asks, you say capped at 28%. Is that of adjusted gross income? I'm not going to explain what adjusted gross income is because I don't want to confuse people. No, it just means that if you give $100, what you can deduct there, or the sort of benefit of that, is only 28% savings instead of 37% savings. So that's a change from what's happening right now, if that happens. So Lori asks, would Mark want to release his Netflix stock? Netflix has been growing pretty quickly. You can imagine people want to keep watching movies in the years ahead. Would it not provide him more benefit to keep it? Well, Lori, this is sort of 2.0, but there's a really interesting strategy here. So Mark would want to give his stock instead of giving cash. Now, why would he do that? Well, he would give stock for $500 of stock and then use the cash he would have given to buy the stock again. Now, this is going to be a little bit more complex, but he would do that because suddenly he no longer owes capital gains. So if he owns Netflix stock and that stock doesn't grow at all, well, then he'll never pay any taxes. If it grows to $1,000, he'll only pay taxes on that $500 gain and not the $900 that he bought it at much earlier. So it's almost always a great thing to give stock, even if you're going to go back and buy more of that same stock to keep your portfolio the same. There's a bunch of questions about what will happen if the Republicans win the Senate, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Great. So let's continue, but I wanted to clarify a couple of those as well, and feel free to add more questions later. So let's talk about estate planning and plan giving. So there's two big things happening here. One is decreasing the threshold for the federal estate tax by about 50% and ending the step-up basis. And I'll explain what the step-up basis is, because if you don't know it, that's totally fine. So estate tax changes. The proposal is that we reduce the estate tax exemption from 11.6 million per person to 5.8 million per person, so about half. Estates are taxed on the value above this number. So if you have a $6.8 million estate, you're paying estate taxes on $1 million, which is the difference between your estate and 5.8 million. So everybody, no matter how wealthy you are, gets this exemption. Most people, that exemption covers your entire estate. Now, for much wealthier people, it covers a portion of it, and you pay estate taxes on everything above that. So I assume you all know what estate taxes are. Roughly, estate taxes, by the way, are about 50%. So they're very, very significant. So it means you're paying 50% on everything that's inherited above that 5.8 million. It also ends the step-up basis, which is potentially more important, and not a lot of people are paying attention to this. So what is a step-up basis? Let's talk about what that looks like. Currently, if you inherit something from your uncle, you do not pay capital gains tax on what you inherit. So you sort of reset the basis. It's almost like you paid whatever price you inherited at, and then you pay capital gains above that. This is true of stocks. It's true of other investments. It's also true of a lot of property. So a lot of property goes up in price over time, especially if your rich uncle bought it in 1975 or 1985 or 1995. That tax is going to be really, really significant. It also means that you're probably going to have to sell that house, because it's unlikely that you're going to just be able to pay $80,000 in capital gains tax if you yourself are not individually wealthy. The Biden proposal ends this, and the heirs pay whatever the deceased would have paid. So now you pay capital gains. If your rich uncle bought Kmart stock in 1975 and it's grown by a factor of 100, you owe capital gains on that as well. And now, so here's an example. If you inherit $20,000 in stock that your uncle paid $10,000 for, you yourself owe significant taxes. Now you have a lot of money, so you can sell that stock to pay the taxes, but it's pretty considerable. By the way, this tax kicks in when you sell it. So you're not immediately on the spot for it, but when you sell it, you're going to owe all that taxes. So this is a really meaningful shift. It's a little wonky, but it's going to drive some very, very different behavior. And it's going to include, so yes, the lower estate tax threshold will increase planned gifts from wealthy people, but the step-up basis is going to affect a lot more people than the estate tax, because this is true basically at any income level. So when you're thinking about passing on property, passing on stock, passing on other appreciated assets, this combined with the changes in capital gains taxes, remember we told you the capital gains taxes are going way up, this will be very powerful in changing behavior. And suddenly planned giving is going to be a lot more meaningful for a lot more people than it has been in the past. And a lot more people are going to pay some taxes on inherited assets than they would have previously. So this is a really big shift. It's been a very, very little discussed part of the policy, but I hope that's clear, and feel free to ask questions about it as well. So we should see a sharp increase in planned gifts if this happens. The bullet point that I was about to say. Okay, so that's what happens if the Democrats win the Senate. If Republicans win the Senate, what's going to happen? Well, we're unlikely to see major legislative tax changes. Anyone who's been paying attention for the last 15, 20 years know that we're going to have a lot less happening in divided government. But if Republicans win, we should still see a meaningful increase in stock giving and donor advised fund giving. Now, why is that the case? So why, if Republicans take the Senate, should we see a big increase in donor advised fund giving and stock giving, even though we're not going to see legislative changes? So I'm going to take a 10-second water break while you guys make some guesses as to why that might be. I have some guesses around regulation, tax benefit, some tax shelters. All right, so just remember that Republicans aren't going to make their own legislation that would likely get vetoed by a Democratic president and not passed by the Democratic House. All right, so I don't actually know whose name it is, but the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Kansas City, and that's the name on Zoom, has it right. So here's why. Divided government tends to be very, very good for the stock market. Now, why is that? Well, investors prefer stability. The more that you can predict, the more people are willing to invest, and the stock market goes up pretty considerably. So while legislative gridlock might be something that we complain about as a general population, and certainly there's some frustrations that people have for very, very good reasons, it creates a very, very stable regulatory environment. You're unlikely to have significant shifts very quickly in legislation or something else that is going to create more risk in the stock market. And so Wall Street is thrilled with the idea of divided government. No tax changes, plus what many people would assume to be a more stable president in the White House. And that sort of predictability is what investments are often built on. So in this world, once you see the Georgia Senate race come through, and if it comes to Republicans, you should still see a pretty sharp increase in stock market, which is going to increase both giving from stocks, because there's more appreciated, more capital gains to avoid, and donor advised funds. Because remember, we told you that most of donor advised funds is actually coming from stocks in the first place. So also special shout out to Lauren, who was the one person who guessed that right over in Kansas City. So congratulations, Lauren. All right, so that's what we should expect. I want to share a couple of tactics to put in place to counteract what we think of as donor fatigue. So this was by far the most expensive election in history, almost twice as much. We'll talk about that in a second. Twice as much as spent in 2016, which is mind-blowing. And yet, the donors, you can imagine that many of these are just tired. People are pulling their credit card out once a day to give to different Senate candidates, different House candidates, and President Trump or Vice President Biden. So what we see here, by the way, all of that was in cash donations. So almost all of it. I mean, occasionally you can do some in-kind contributions, but basically everything is a check or credit card. Political campaigns never take anything else. So everything we talk about, planned gifts, stocks, donor advised funds, QCDs, charitable lead trusts, none of this is available to political campaigns. And so if you can actually focus on these non-competitive types of giving, you won't hit the same level of donor fatigue that you would if you just asked for more cash donations. Because someone who just gave $200 to the Biden campaign or $250 to the Trump campaign every month for 10 months because this was so important, and you can imagine how ginned up everybody was about the election, are now sort of tired of giving cash. And so this is really tough because we're now heading into end of year season, and suddenly we just need a little bit more cash to make sure that we're hitting our goals from a nonprofit fundraising standpoint. If you can instead focus on the type of gifts that they haven't given at all in the last year, then you'll have much more success. And we really see this shift happening when we talk to donors. They say, oh, given my allotted charitable giving, a lot of that went to Joe Biden this year because it's so important, or a lot of that went to Donald Trump because I support the president. And instead, if you can sort of say, like, great, well, a lot of people are getting out of investments right now. Have you thought about that? And they haven't made any gifts out of investments this year. And so it's much more likely to avoid that donor fatigue. That is a real fear right now in a lot of nonprofits. This, by the way, is the single biggest, we talked about this a while ago, but the gap between organizations that succeed because they get non-cash gifts and the ones that fail because they're only getting cash is enormous. So this is the single biggest difference besides what type of organization you are in terms of whether or not nonprofits are missing or surpassing their goals this year. It's so striking to see it across the board. Every time we talk to different nonprofit fundraising professionals, either they're struggling or a couple of non-cash gifts are the things that help them hit their goals. The biggest differences, by the way, in whether people are successful with non-cash gifts is whether or not gift officers feel confident in asking for non-cash gifts. This is just a huge shift. And in some organizations, they're really good about this, and they're generating 3 and 4 and 5 times larger gifts from the same people. In some places, they're a little bit nervous about it. They mostly focus on cash, and they're just getting maybe the same number of gifts, but they end up being much smaller. The second thing, what drives confidence, we figured out, is it's all about effective training in asking for non-cash gifts. So we've seen people will sit through a QCD training and the next day go out and close a $100,000 QCD gift. But they need to have that confidence from having effective training. And then our team's willing to broadly market non-cash gifts. So the organizations that are getting a ton of QCDs are the ones that are emailing about that to 70+ donors, or even including it as an option in their broad marketing if they don't have age data. So your colleges, a lot of your health systems have really good age data to target donors. Animal rights organization might not have that, but they're still including QCDs and other types of giving in their normal fundraising asks. And that's the difference for a lot of folks between hitting their goals and missing them. One thing that we've done to try to be helpful here is we've created a totally free class around stock giving. I think a couple hundred people have already signed up to take it. And frankly, the reviews have been really good, which is really exciting to us. So this is 1.5 CFRE credits. It's totally free until the end of the year. It's also go at your own pace. So you can sign up for it in the survey and we'll just send you a link. You can share it with your entire organization. Literally, whether your gift officers are trained up in stock giving and other non-cash is going to be one of the biggest difference makers for your organization. So forget about getting good at stocks, think about getting good at fundraising. This is one of the big keys. Anita, just says the stock masterclass is awesome. Thank you. You are not paid or prompted to say that, so I really, really appreciate it. As you can tell, it's a lot of work by a lot of people. All right, so tip one is just make sure you're getting smart about non-cash giving. That is how you will get through a lot of donor fatigue, and it's going to be one of the biggest drivers of hitting your goals this year. Okay, tip two, I really, really love this because it's super easy to do. It takes no work, and it generates, on average, I think like 30–35% higher giving. You want to treat end-of-year giving as a special occasion. And what I mean by this is framing a donation as exceptional, uncommon, infrequent, removes it from comparison with regular income, and it drives significant charitable giving. So I'll show an example in a second, but a simple switch in wording. So when you're talking about end of year giving in particular, saying only once a year versus saying annual, it makes a huge difference. It also reduces feelings of fatigue. Do you ever get that feeling of someone's like, oh, you should really learn X, and you think, man, I can't sign up for one more thing. Like, no more ongoing responsibilities for me. I am tired. Well, if you say, look, we're going to do this thing only once, well, okay, I can do that. That feels very manageable. And it reduces this feeling of fatigue. Fatigue is not just people being tired, it's people being overwhelmed. So when you're talking about adding a new responsibility, something annual and regular, people are going to back off. When you do it only once or only once a year, then people feel like, oh, I can check that off and I actually feel in control, and then I'll be done. So really, really big shift overall, and that the research on that is remarkable. So go back through your end of year marketing and just make sure you're not using the word annual or too regular, and focus on this exceptionalism, and you should see very significant results for, frankly, very little work here. Heidi asks, what if you ask twice a year? Does it still work? Yes. So each time you want to just treat it as exceptional, right? So we only do this once in a while. Would you make a gift? Instead, if we do this every 6 months, like clockwork, that's where you're going to say, ooh, clockwork is overwhelming. I don't want to sign up for anything in the future. I don't want to feel like things are regular. So great question. It doesn't have to be once a year or not. It just has to be treated as special and uncommon. Even in wild times, this is an example, by the way, our big campaign happens only once a year. Many supporters are marking the occasion by making a gift out of their investments to kick off a new decade of hope and impact. Now, let's see what happens here. So even in wild times, our big campaign happens only once a year. So only feel special. Many supporters are marking the occasion, right? We're marking the occasion, it means special, unusual. Also, we're using social proof here. Many supporters, instead of you should do this, many supporters are doing this. They're marking the occasion to kick off a new decade of hope and impact. Now, people forget that decades start the first year, 2021 or 1991 or 2001, and not in the 2000, which is the last year of the decade. And so treating this as a new decade makes it even more special, right? So think about, look, this, new decade, let's mark the occasion. And you yourself know that if you're going out to dinner, when we used to go out to dinner, or doing something else, feeling like it's a special occasion will lead you to spend a lot more money than if it's a regular Thursday date night with your spouse or whatever it might be. So think about that. You can sort of see it in your own life as well. If you want your sister, your brother, your spouse, your partner, whatever, to do something, make sure you frame it as a special occasion. Hey, just, let's celebrate the good news by doing this favorite thing I like, instead of let's just do this thing I like, because it might be a great new hobby for us. Okay, so that is a bunch of the tips. I already mentioned this. My colleague Simone is going to drop a link into the survey. I love this book. It's one of the things that I think has changed my life, similar to the writing book that we talked about a few weeks ago. So Simone's going to drop in a survey. Please make a note in the survey if you would like a copy, and we'll send a bunch out. We don't have endless money to send them to everybody on this call, sorry, but we'll send a bunch out. All right, a couple of resources here. First thing, the masterclass we already talked about, that also make a note in the survey if you can. If you are a FreeWill partner, we also have a QCD masterclass. This has also gotten a lot of good reviews. If any of the legislative changes, we'll update it for next year. So feel free to take that, and we'll let you know what's changed as we go forward. But this is one of the things where people will take it and go out and close $50,000 gifts the next week, because suddenly it's front of mind and they just feel a little bit more comfortable doing it. So half of this is teaching you what to do. Half of it's just making you feel comfortable and feeling confident so you can actually go put that in action. All right, a couple other things happening. So next week, we're not having a formal session, but we are having some breakouts so that we can talk about some key discussion points, and that will be in small groups of 4 and 5 and 6. Really good to sort of share some tips that you'll share with other people and other people share with you about end of year giving, about surviving this moment, but also just, you know, as you are all continuing to build your careers, meeting new people and sort of learning about new opportunities will also be really helpful. So either do it to build your career, or I would ask, some of you might think, well, I'm in my last few years of my job and then I might retire. You can be really helpful to those people. So if you want to connect with folks, I'm sure a lot of people need mentorship, and a lot of people need, a lot of people are able to mentee. And then one last thing is, last week, or 2 weeks ago, we got this comment. They said, I can't believe I'm saying this because I normally hate when webinars spend half the time selling a product, but you should start with an intro of FreeWill, how nonprofits can use it. The short answer is no. It's really important to us that we keep this focused on learning and as valuable as possible, not a sales pitch at all. If you do want to hear about FreeWill, you can definitely go to one of these sessions, which is a group demo that we hold pretty regularly, and just walk people through the tools. So we're not going to do that here. The real goal is to get you guys as smart as possible. But if you want to learn what other nonprofits are doing and how they're using these tools, again, you can sign up in the survey as well. That's on Thursday at 1 o'clock. All right, so we are here. We've got a little bit of time for questions. We'll try to get through a bunch of it, and then we'll let everybody get back to their day, maybe even a little bit earlier, and fill out the survey. But a couple of people noted in the chat about the book. Just make sure you fill the survey out because the chat sort of disappears when the Zoom window closes. Okay, good. Let's look at some questions. Is there a good time? I like this question a lot. Is there a good time of year to ask for non-cash gifts? Yes. So end of year is a really good time to ask for non-cash gifts. Now, why is that? You can think about giving in really 3 different formats. So the first is what we would call relational. So I've got 4 godchildren. They're really cute and wonderful. When one of them is like selling cookies for his school or selling magazines or whatever, I'm buying a magazine, I'm making a donation. If he's doing a fun run, I'm chipping in. I don't really care what the cause is. Like, I'm sure it's a good cause, but mostly I love my godsons, and so I'm doing to support them. So relational is type 1. That's usually going to be cash. I'm very rarely going to give a QCD or a stock or a donor advised fund gift that way. Second type of giving is what we call reactive. So relational and reactive. Reactive is, there is a big fire in Northern California, and there is a big hurricane in New Orleans. Something happened in politics that makes me really angry. There's a crisis overseas. I'm sort of reactive, and I'm giving, again, usually, but not always, in cash or checks or credit cards or something else like that. And then what we think of as more sort of structured giving. And this is, every year we sit down at the kitchen table and we give away 7 gifts. And that's usually the church, the alma mater, maybe local conservation, maybe a human rights organization that's really important to me. And that sort of like kitchen table planning is where you're going to end up with these non-cash gifts. So it's less the like urgent fire happening in Northern California, we need supplies, and much more, what is the gift you're making to your secondary school, your animal shelter, your church this year? That's the kind of giving that you can move into non-cash gifts. And those gifts end up being much larger than the sort of rapid response credit card swiping. So I hope that's helpful. Amanda, thanks so much. Alice says, will you review this information once we know who wins the Senate? So probably January 5th, January 7th, somewhere around there. Yes, so we will sync back up afterwards and make sure we know exactly what's happening. And it's all a spectrum, right? So if the Senate's 50-50, you might get somewhat less aggressive tax planning than if it was a 54-46 split for Democrats. Jen says, what is the best way to start the non-cash conversation? Let me model that for you very quickly. A couple of things here. Jen, really like to talk to you. So thanks so much for your support. I saw some of the impact that you're having, and probably share a quick anecdote about what's happened in the past. I did want to share what a lot of other people are doing, especially with some of the recent tax changes. And I thought maybe it might be helpful to you, whether, even for your giving here or giving to any charity, to better understand what some of your peers are doing. Would you like me to share some more information? And 2 things there. 1, we're coming back to social proof, right? So I'm sharing what other people are doing. And 2, I'm making it clear that this information will be helpful no matter where you're giving. So if I work at Georgetown, which is my alma mater, and say, look, Maybe this will be helpful for your giving to Georgetown, but I hope it's helpful for your giving to any charity anywhere. Then the donor really is open-minded because we're adding benefit, not just sort of narrowly interested. And obviously that's going to shift my giving to Georgetown. So that's sort of leading with kindness and leading with service and sharing what other people are doing creates a really welcoming, open dynamic instead of saying, look, you know, you've been giving cash and I think it's a mistake. That's a high pressure sales tactic, which is less likely to work than being really open and thoughtful. Shona asked, how soon will the presentation be emailed out? Probably a few hours. Usually what happens is Zoom processes all of it. So that's the blocker. All right, let's take one or two more questions, then we'll give some folks some time back. Catherine asks, did you say getting better at getting stock gifts before they get to donor advised funds? So this is a really important point, and I can't say it enough. So many people come to us and say, what do we do about donor advised funds? Or my board or my executive director really wants us to raise more money of donor advised funds because they keep hearing that donor advised funds are growing. And frankly, there's some animosity or frustration in the nonprofit world because money that could be going to charities is going first to donor advised funds and usually eventually going to charities. And so the pitch that I would make is, if so much money is going to donor advised funds, we have to understand why is that happening. And it's not because donors think, wow, what I would really like to do is have impact, but have that impact in 4 years as opposed to right now. Nobody has that kind of patience. Instead, what's happening is that donor advised funds are really, really good. Make it really, really easy to donate stock or other non-cash assets to them, that then you can sort of slowly filter your gifts out. And a lot of charities don't make it easy and accessible for me to give stock or other non-cash assets to them. So if you can sort of if you can take the shortcut and get those gifts directly, that is a more effective strategy than trying to go out and figure out who has donor advised funds, which is still useful, but it's not going to be as game-changing as getting that money before it gets into the fund in the first place. Great. Cassandra mentions that she also went to Georgetown. So nice to see you, Cassandra. All right, let's do one more question and then we'll pause there. So this is a question, it's an anonymous one, but what are the tax benefits for donors as they give cryptocurrency? So things like Bitcoin. What are the tax implications for a nonprofit? So we can actually treat crypto or cryptocurrency very much the way we treat publicly traded stocks. So I own a very small amount of Bitcoin because I got talked into it by a friend a while ago. It's gone up a little bit, it's not that exciting. But if I sell it, I owe capital gains on that the same way that I would owe capital gains on Apple stock or something else. So I can give it to a charity, the charity can take it. There are some pretty easy ways to set up accounts to take this money. You can Google that, I don't have any special insight there. And then you liquidate it the same day, the same way you would a publicly traded stock. So while Bitcoin is very, very different than Apple stock, for the nonprofit purposes, it's basically treated the same way. And all of the same things you just saw about the change in capital gains rates, the different ways we're taxation, all of that will apply to Bitcoin and a couple other cryptocurrencies. Ethereum is probably the second most popular one. And so you'll see a little bit of increase in giving from Bitcoin. But frankly, I think people who have Bitcoin tend to be a little bit younger, tend to give a little bit less comparatively, and are sort of more bullish on that growing to a very large degree, and so they're less likely to donate it right now. Okay, one last question. Heidi says, some large nonprofits are offering DAFs. At what point should we consider that? Heidi, I don't know what organization you're with. I would shy away from that. It can be pretty complex. And unless you are sort of Harvard, Yale, the Nature Conservancy, that level of complexity, it's probably not worth the effort if you think about what you could do with the same amount of time and effort in terms of generating other gifts. So good question. We can dive into that at a future session. All right, so let's pause there. It is 12:55 on the East Coast, 9:55 on the West Coast, 6:55, I believe, to the folks in Hawaii who often join at 6 in the morning. So bless your heart for doing that. Thank you so much, all. If you get a moment, please fill out the survey, both for the book. The masterclass is also in there. But really, we would just love your feedback. And so there's some questions there around, should we be doing these in December, or are you guys too busy? And what topics would be really valuable? So we'd love it. Really nice to see everybody. Thanks so much for spending time today. And look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.